To put it slightly more personally, one of the other concepts that came up for me was grief and weeping. Right? That when you kind of let go of the holding of the tightness of your heart to allow the grief to flow, and the weeping takes over. Right? This is exactly the same kind of thing. It's now you're in a tumult that has got its own arc, and you're just going to be in it until it sort of flows through you. And it's an unpleasantness that is a necessity associated with healing. I know people who are good at that. I know people who are able to notice the necessity.
Yes.
Who can flow into grief and can throw into true, like not simulated, real weeping and grief, and allow it to just kind of flow through them in a way that, for example, I cannot. So I dread the thing largely because of my, what would it be? Well, maturity is a word that comes up for sure. Like a lack of maturity in relationship with the suffering. And suffering I hear mean to undergo, like the undergoing of that.
Yeah, loss of agency. Yeah.
So to become more mature, but I don't think there's a soft path of becoming more mature. No matter what, there's always going to be a first time, and that first time is going to be big.
Well, one of the things that I felt when you brought up grief, right, was this way that the grieving process in some way is this, it's this kind of almost this innate, deep, natural de-idolatrizing something, right?
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Right, which is, you know, I'm married to you, or I have this thing, and it's been there my whole life, and I have all these qualities of being that my mind is fused with this person, this thing, and then that person goes away. And because it's fused, like you could say the grief, this is why it's not sadness. It's like, basically at first you feel like, I'm never going to feel love ever again for the rest of my life. I will never feel that kind of closeness that we shared, because they're fused in your mind. But then you cry and you go through the process and the denial and the anger and all of that stuff. If that happens, at some point that process kind of leads into this place where, okay, love itself and the image of this person start to become distinguished, right? And so when you start to break into this acceptance, it's because you've no longer are like having idolatry with that person. You've reclaimed being in being's place, right?
I want to add a dimension. I don't think this is pushback, but part of what I've seen in grief is it's actually not lying to you when it says to you, you will never love this way again, because you won't. In fact, if you try, this is the classic rebound mistake. If you try to replicate what you had, then you're screwed. Or but on the other hand, if you just deify like I know people that don't properly grieve because they start to deify the dead person. And they become a sainted figure, and it's bullshit, right? And then they can't ever. So I see, again, there's a tension here. There's a tension between, like you said, grief is telling us, okay, they weren't a god. Mm-hmm. But I think grief is also asking us to recognize, yeah, but there is something you're never going to get back. You're facing irrecoverable loss. No matter what, you can fall in love again. You will.
Yes.
And in that sense, your grief is telling you a lie, but grief is telling you the truth. You will never love that way again. Right? And it's trying to get you between those two, right? That's what I'm hearing. And to me, agape is both of those. Agape is, right, you are trying to nurture the suchness of this person, like their specific, unique mystery. Right? But you're not deifying them. There's something about how do we have due reverence for the irreplaceability, the mystery of what we are bringing into being without turning it into a god.
Yes.
And I think grief and agape are wrapped up in that way with each other. And I mean, we have to think about the opposite of grief. I think joy is when we have that, when we deeply participate agapically in something and we just want to celebrate its existence, but we are not worshiping it as a god, right? And I think, like, I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean for me to have joy with Sarah, and the fact that it is making me vulnerable, and I'm using that term very deliberately given Guy's distinction. It's making me vulnerable to future grief. And there's part of me that does what Chris says. Part of me says, my will can't change that reality, but I can assent to it rather than just merely be the victim of it. I can say, I choose the future grief because I choose the joy because I feel a reverence and responsibility for how agape binds me to the irreplaceable mystery without making me treat the person as anything but a mortal. Because if I could treat them as a god, I'll never face grief. If they're a god, I'll never face grief.
I just want to clarify. So the grief process, if you let yourself go through it, is the process of unfusing the face from the idea, right?
But that's just because we don't practice, like Chris said. We don't do premeditatio the way the Stoics or the Buddhists did. We don't practice grief ahead of time.
Yeah.
If we do, they don't have to be confused. I'm saying it's not inevitable that they have to be confused. That is a psychological consequence of our lack of skill and our ignorance.
Yes.
See, this is where the dimensions come back together. What I'm hearing is that, successful grief, it's a weird way of putting it, wise grief, edifying grief, converts the person whom we grieve from an idol into a symbol.
An icon.
An icon. Mm-hmm. And that means that we see them and by means of them at the same times, right? The translucency of the symbolic. So
right.
Our love is not forever inextricably bound up with that person and dies with them. However, they and their likeness becomes a way of re-invoking our connection to the very love that they once stood for, made possible, and now will always be making possible in perpetuity. And that's why the vertical affordance, the vertical affordance for the love itself gets resituated into the horizontal, the historical relationship we had with that person, which is now always going to be a feature of who we are as characters.
Right.
So the grief is a way of binding the vertical and the historical together, the vertical and the horizontal together by means of the symbolization of that which was once an idol. Being it by means of it.
Okay. Can I take this one?
Yeah, please. Keep bubbling.
So so just to hold a little bit the metaphor or the particular example of food poisoning and the language of processing or healing or suffering as the experience of undergoing the process whereby we metabolize a particular experience so as to heal and grow through it. Okay? And then we have grief is that. Right? That's the argument I'm making is grief is just that. So when, for example, a loved one dies, this is one of the most momentous possibilities for our own metabolizing and growing that is available in the human experience. Right? It is only by experiencing the death of your own father that you are able to go through a portal of growth that is part of the natural arc of being a human. That's the only possible way that can happen in the universe. And so that is the last and final greatest gift that individual could possibly give to their children, right? And grief is literally the name that we call that experience. That's the experience we're having. That's the name that we give it. Joy is the emergence of that which will be giving us grief in the future as it is coming into being in the first place. So the birth of a child has the feeling of joy, right? We feel this momentous possibility emerging into earth, right? Joy is the name that we give to possibilities that's beginning to actualize. And grief is the name that we give when actuality is giving itself back for the resurgence of possibility, for the purpose of nurturing and giving rise to the growth of that which is.
One of the wisest people in my life, when I was experiencing a profound grief, he said to me, John, don't ever get in a deep relationship with somebody who hasn't experienced grief. And it took me years to get the wisdom of that.